He's France's worst villain, hounding Jews, persecuting Jews.
Paul Touvier sent my mother to Auschwitz.
Members of the Catholic Church who were pro-Nazi helped him escape.
My job is to arrest Mr. Touvier.
Finding the man is not going to be easy.
They searched a number of monasteries.
We were stepping into a sacred place.
When I started, nothing could stop me.
The Second World War had been over for 43 years. Yet France's most notorious war criminal was still at large. He was a Nazi collaborator who murdered Jews and French resistance fighters alike. Paul Touvier. Now a high-ranking detective was given the task of hunting him down.
It was in March 1988 when a magistrate of the Paris court gave me the Touvier case.
Colonel Recordon is someone who's very determined. When he decides to do something, he'll do everything he can to make it happen.
Over the years, the French National Police had tried and failed to bring the war criminal to justice. But Colonel Jean-Louis Recordon had a hard-won reputation as a tough and skilled investigator. This, his most recent mission, was top secret.
For roughly 40 years, Touvier was hidden somewhere and nobody was able to arrest him.
Searching through the Touvier case files, Recordon was transported back to one of the darkest periods in French history. When the Nazis invaded France, many French men and women heroically resisted. Others, like Paul Touvier, wholeheartedly collaborated.
He worked with the Germans during the war, and in fact they joined with German units to actually fight against the resistance.
As one of the leaders of a pro-Nazi paramilitary force, Touvier's job was to capture perceived enemies of the state.
Touvier selected 7 people, and he said himself it was because they were Jewish. They were stood up against the wall and shot.
Even in the 1980s, there were people in high places who had collaborated with the Nazis. People who were sympathetic to Paul Touvier.
I was concerned about potential leaks because I was fully aware about the fact that in the French administration, but not only in the French administration, in the French society, Touvier had supporters.
When someone's been hiding for 40 years, the chances of finding him are next to nothing.
I mentioned to the magistrate the fact that this case should be an impossible mission. But when I started, nothing could stop me.
For this mission impossible, Colonel Recordon joined forces with a seasoned investigator, Dominique Bélanger.
When I received the Paul Touvier file, I knew it was very sensitive. Our division only dealt with very sensitive cases. It was a secret investigation.
I was fully blind, I would say. I have no information about his current physical appearance, of course.
The problem with searching for Paul Touvier was that we didn't even know if he was alive.
Touvier faked his own death because at some point he'd put a notice in the newspaper, Paul Touvier is dead. But since there was no proof of his death, we continued with the investigation.
I started to define the Touvier networks, his relatives, his supporters, and all people mentioning in the dossier. And I was interested by one fact. I noticed several times the influence of the Catholic Church.
There was a long-standing rumor going around that Paul Touvier had been sheltered by far-right elements within the French Catholic Church.
He clearly had received some important support.
If that were true, it wouldn't be the first time that sympathetic Catholic clergy had aided and abetted Nazi fugitives.
I think members of the Catholic Church who were pro-Nazi helped people escape after the war.
The church had this tradition of standing outside the secular authority and assisting those people in trouble without asking any questions.
This part of the French story is always very controversial.
It does seem very fishy that everybody who helped the Nazis happened to be connected to the Catholic Church.
The hunt for war criminal Paul Touvier exposed deep religious and political divisions in France that dated back many years. When the Germans defeated France in 1940, they split the nation in half. The Nazis occupied the north. In the south, they set up a puppet government based at the town of Vichy. The Vichy government created its own version of the Gestapo, the Milice.
The Milice was created essentially as a paramilitary police force to fight the resistance. It's an expression in its ideology of the most extreme elements in Vichy. It's overtly anti-Semitic.
And Touvier made a career in the Milice, and he really took to it. And he did so well that he was promoted. He became the person in charge of intelligence gathering for the Milice office.
He was an absolute ideological fanatic. The Jews and the resistance, these were enemies of France, and they were to be eliminated.
Well, after the war, there was a serious effort in France to purge French society of people who had collaborated with the Germans.
Collaborators like Paul Touvier, who was desperate to avoid the hangman's noose.
Touvier came from a devout Catholic family, and he was a devout Catholic himself. And when he looked around for help, he thought perhaps the church could help him.
I assumed the Catholic Church could be an important element to be investigated.
Recordon discovered that Touvier's last known postal address was the Archdiocese of Lyon.
We wanted to obtain the authorization to examine the archives of the Archbishop.
It was quite a delicate inquiry.
The magistrate and the detective drove 300 miles south to Lyon. They decided that the magistrate would meet the Archbishop alone in order to gain his trust.
We obtained a meeting with the Archbishop, but I stay outside the Archbishop office. I was very anxious. It was sensitive. The Archbishop was very reluctant to authorize the police to investigate Catholic archives.
Recordon's request to see the archive was turned down flat, which only served to deepen his suspicions.
For me, it's an habit to meet numerous people who don't want to cooperate with me. It's not a problem for me. Okay, you don't want to cooperate directly? Okay, I will use another way.
9 months into his investigation, Récordon became convinced that Touvier was being hidden by right-wing elements within the Catholic Church.
To remain impossible to find, to stay hidden while in France, the perfect place for this was a religious setting, whether in monasteries or abbeys that could shelter entire families or individuals.
The police concentrated on the right-wing ultra-traditionalist movement within the church.
We were focused mainly on one in the monastery. Due to the fact that Touvier worked for a certain time in the 70s around this monastery.
It was the Notre-Dame-des-Dômes monastery in central France.
I decided to send Bélanger inside the monastery in order to find some clues of the presence of Touvier or his family.
Officer Bélanger went undercover, posing as an ex-convict seeking charity.
We were stepping into a privileged, secretive place. It's another world, cloistered and also protected.
It was a very impenetrable system and very effective.
It's very difficult to infiltrate these religious communities because there's an element of mistrust. Very few lay people gain access. I worked there during the day and at night had the run of the abbey.
Bélanger searched the establishment for incriminating information.
Every detail we gathered motivated us.
But the undercover operation yielded nothing substantial.
There were several people staying at the monastery, but none of them resembled Touvier. It was demoralizing. We had to come up with another strategy.
So the team decided to try a different tactic. They tapped the phones of a number of religious communities.
We had created a network of phone taps in every place where Paul Touvier could have been called.
All wiretapping devices were remotely connected to the basement of my offices.
When you do phone taps, you hear many different voices. But when you listen to the same people constantly, you start to recognize voices. You know how they speak, what they're talking about, and who's there. That's the technique of phone tapping. And then we got a lucky break. An article appeared in a national newspaper talking about Paul Touvier's relationship with elements of the church.
Coincidentally, an independent investigative reporter had also been delving into the war criminal's past. Like the police, the reporter had concluded that Touvier was probably being aided by Catholic clergy. His article gave the investigators their first major breakthrough.
As soon as the article was published, we started overhearing phone conversations. Certain people were worried about how the press had discovered this information.
Right after the article came out, at one point we heard a phrase we understood perfectly to be, "Our friend Paul is not going to be happy."
For me, it was marvelous, very, very nice thing. And people were saying, we have to help our friend Paul. Paul is now under surveillance. We have to take care, and so on and so on.
One call in particular offered a promising lead. On the phone was Jean-Pierre Lefebvre, the head of a militant far-right Catholic group called the Knights of Notre Dame. The Knights were a fringe movement of the church, founded before the war. On the other end of the line was Dom Lafont, abbot of a Benedictine monastery called St. Paul de Wisque.
It seems that the Wisque monastery and the home of Jean-Pierre Lefebvre could be two links of the chain.
Detectives had found evidence linking war criminal Paul Touvier to a monastery in northern France and a secretive far-right Catholic sect.
I decided, with the agreement of the magistrate, to launch the operation. I sent two different teams, one in Wisque in order to make an investigation in the monastery, and the other team to the home of Jean-Pierre Lefebvre.
The manhunt intensified. Bélanger arrived at the monastery of St. Paul de Wisque, armed with a search warrant.
It wasn't normal practice to enter religious institutions. We questioned Dom Lafont. He wanted to phone his superiors and tell them what was happening. He thought that would scare us.
Lafont was smiling, thinking we had no chance to find Touvier.
We conducted a search. Dom Lafont didn't believe it. Police just didn't search a convent.
Bélanger grilled the abbot, but Lafont insisted he knew nothing of the war criminal.
We said we would stay with him. We detained him for 48 hours. He realized we weren't going anywhere.
Eventually, the abbot gave in. In a startling admission, he revealed he was part of a conspiracy to protect Paul Touvier.
He put us on to the Knights of Notre Dame.
So the detectives brought in the leader of the Catholic sect, Jean-Pierre Lefebvre, for questioning.
When Jean-Pierre Lefebvre was in the hand of an investigator for interrogation, he started to deny to know Touvier.
But the team had already discovered that Lefebvre and Touvier shared a dark past. The militant religious leader once fought alongside Nazi SS officers.
In the basement of the house of Jean-Pierre Lefebvre, the investigators discovered numerous documents related to World War II.
Like Paul Touvier, Lefebvre was one of thousands of Frenchmen who betrayed their country. Touvier worked closely with the notorious Klaus Barbie. Barbie was known as the Butcher of Lyon, and Touvier the Hangman of Lyon.
Klaus Barbie was the head of the intelligence branch of the Gestapo office in Lyon, and Touvier was the head of the intelligence branch of the Milice office in Lyon, and they were certainly in the same line of work.
But Barbie was German. Touvier had no such excuse. He was a traitor who persecuted his own countrymen.
80,000 Jews died in France during the occupation. About 76,000 of them were deported.
His activities as a member of the Milice combine hounding Jews, persecuting, chasing down Jews, fighting the resistance, but also he becomes very much of a mafia-like figure.
Vladimir Zant's mother was at a Lyon synagogue when Touvier and his henchmen arrived.
Paul Touvier come with his truck and stop in front of the synagogue Tilsit, and some men enter the synagogue. He took all Jewish people, among them my mother, and was directed to a prison in Lyon, then deported to Auschwitz.
Crimes such as these led detectives to question the leader of the Knights of Notre Dame about Paul Touvier.
Several hours later, the investigator came in my office saying he don't want to speak, he don't want to cooperate. It's why I decided to join the interrogation.
Recordon employed a ruse to persuade his witness to open up.
I made a remark saying there is other hunters who are on the track of Paul Touvier, and these people are going to work for their own interest and are very ill-intentioned regarding Paul Touvier. When I said this, Lefebvre looked at me carefully. Wiesenthal, Klarsfeld, I shrugged the shoulders. It could be.
He hoped Lefebvre would consider it safer to turn Touvier over to the police than to risk Nazi hunters like the Klarsfelds or Simon Wiesenthal getting hold of him.
And I said, if something wrong happened to Touvier and his family, you will be responsible.
The ploy worked. The former SS officer admitted the Knights of Notre Dame had been supplying money to the war criminal.
Lefebvre told me that each month he sent 3,000 French francs, roughly $600 to a woman located in Paris.
Paul Touvier's flight from justice had lasted more than 40 years. After the war, he was convicted in absentia of treason and war crimes.
Touvier, it manages to stay in hiding and to survive until the 20-year statute of limitations runs out on the charges against him. What he wanted was to be able to inherit and to move back into his father's home. Move in with his wife and children, lead a normal life, if you will.
Although the charges against Touvier had expired, he was still banned from owning property in his hometown. He was very keen to reclaim his property and his reputation.
The only way he could get an inheritance when his dad died was to get a pardon from President Pompidou.
In the 1960s and 70s, Touvier still had high-ranking friends in the French government and the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. After a long and vigorous campaign by a sympathetic bishop, he received his pardon in November 1971.
Ce monsieur Touvier a été condamné à mort à la libération par contumace.
When President Pompidou pardoned him of his last remaining charges, it backfired.
Protests erupted across France. Famous Nazi hunters Serge and Beate Klarsfeld spearheaded the demonstrations.
The reaction of the world of the resistance was impressive, many protests.
There was outrage that, first of all, that these crimes had essentially gone unpunished after all. Regardless of the legal questions, I mean, this man was a murderer, unquestionably a murderer.
We protested immediately, and we invaded even the house of Touvier.
Touvier was under siege. In desperation, he agreed to do a television interview, in disguise, to defend his war record.
But what could I have done? What? Faced with the Germans, who were the masters of the country.
But his victims weren't fooled. They issued writs against Touvier. As a result, he was charged with crimes against humanity, charges which are not subject to any statute of limitations.
Touvier goes from being a man who looks like he's going to slide back into kind of a comfortable anonymity and live in his family home to a celebrity of the worst kind. And then he's forced to go into hiding again.
It was the charges of crimes against humanity that led Recordon and his men to pursue Paul Touvier. The detectives followed the money trail to Paris and the elderly secretary of a Catholic charity.
We confirmed that there was a network set up to collect money. The money was passed on to Touvier through a woman called Geneviève Penou.
Recordon paid a visit to Penou to question her about the money.
I explained to this woman the purpose of my investigation. She answered she don't want to help. I was amazed by this kind of answer.
But finally, Récordon wore her down.
She requested to phone her priest in order to obtain his agreement, because she don't want to be in infringement with the divine justice. It was amazing. It was amazing. The priest advised the woman, please give the information to the investigator.
Madame Penou revealed that she had been sending money to Paul Touvier at an enclosed Carmelite convent 200 miles south of Paris.
For her, it was an obligation, according to the Catholic rule, to help this family.
At this stage of the investigation, things started to accelerate very quickly. So the team left Paris by plane. At that time, the police had their own planes, and 4 of us left. Another group went by car.
After 4 decades, the net was closing in around Paul Touvier. But there was a very real danger that if he got wind of the operation, he would vanish.
It's why I decided to move very quickly.
French detectives were closing in on war criminal Paul Touvier. They had flown to his last known hiding place, a convent 200 miles south of Paris.
A sister was surprised about the huge number of police officers in front of her. I said, I am in charge to perform an investigation in your convent.
We met the Mother Superior and the abbot. We told them why we were there. We had to conduct a search.
The team questioned the nuns, while Récordon confronted the abbot.
And I started to interrogate this priest. Touvier, I don't know Touvier.
There was a small chapel behind some buildings and garages.
I was at the entrance discussing with the priest when one of my investigators came to me saying, we have found some suitcases with the name of Paul Lacroix.
In one building, we found some cases labeled with a name that we recognized as one of Paul Touvier's aliases. We opened the cases and discovered Paul Touvier's past.
And the first thing we saw was the Iron Cross. I look at the priest. You don't know Touvier? My investigator looked at the document, Paul Touvier, and so on. You don't know this guy?
The investigators hadn't found the war criminal, but they had found solid proof that certain Catholic clergy had been harboring him. In one trunk, they discovered writings by the Nazi propagandist Philippe Henriot. It indicated a direct link to one of the worst wartime atrocities committed by Touvier.
Philippe Henriot was the minister of propaganda under Vichy, and he was a hero of the Milice.
Philippe Henriot was an extremely effective radio commentator. He was doing quite a lot of damage to the Allied cause. He was really getting somewhere with these radio broadcasts. The resistance assassinated him on the 28th of June.
And throughout France, miliciens groups and other supporters of Vichy decided to exact vengeance. The account that finally emerges is that he rounded up a number of Jews, and then he took 7 of these and took them out early in the morning at the end of June 1944, and lined them up against a cemetery wall and shot them.
Paul Touvier must have been living there, but left very quickly. There were current photos of him with his children and his wife. This was our treasure. We had a photo. That was important, because the most recent photo we had was from 1973. We questioned the abbot, and he said he didn't know anything.
I say, you have to respect the French law. Now, where is Paul Touvier?
The Mother Superior then took matters into her own hands.
Mother Superior asked the abbot to swear on the cross that he didn't know anything. He was trapped. Mother Superior really shook him up. She made him admit that he knew where Paul Touvier was.
He said to me, Touvier, for 2 weeks, is at the Saint-Joseph Monastery in Nice.
This was a pivotal, critical moment in the case. Nice was 500 miles south on the Mediterranean coast. There was no time to lose.
It was 11 p.m. Due to the fact that my team was very tired and more tired than me, I decided to take the wheel and to drive myself until Nice. Nothing could stop my investigation.
The French detectives raced through the night. They were speeding to a monastery in Nice. After more than a year, their hunt for Paul Touvier was entering the end game.
We had to move fast. We hadn't slept since Monday. We'd been on the go with no rest. We drove at 150, 160.
I took one photograph with me, and with this photograph, now I can put an image on a guy. Now Touvier, for me, was very well identified.
Colonel Récordon phoned ahead to the authorities in Nice. He asked them to surround the monastery so that no one could enter or leave.
And I said it was a very important case. I cannot speak about it by phone, but I have in my pocket an arrest warrant.
At dawn, we arrived in the outskirts of Nice. There were already 6 or 7 undercover police officers surrounding the monastery. Récordon told my colleague and I to go round the back, so we could enter from the rear and the front at the same time. But we weren't sure if he was inside. We had our doubts. We just didn't know.
I knocked at the door, and a priest opened the door. He was surprised, and I suppose a little bit terrified.
The priest panicked and then tried to prevent the investigators from entering.
I had placed my foot in the door, and violently I opened the door.
In the meantime, we were in the courtyard, broke down the door and met up with Récordon. 4 of us were inside, but there was only one central staircase.
And my investigators rushed in the staircase. I grasped the sleeve of the priest, and together we climbed the staircase.
At the top of the stairs, there were 2 corridors. Recordon went left with one colleague, and I went right with another.
By investigator, a few seconds opening on each side, the door, and I followed, taking the priest by the sleeve. And at this stage, my heart was bumping quickly, and near the end of the corridor, I noticed an investigator stand still in the frame of the door. And in the middle of the room, I saw Paul Touvier.
After more than 4 decades on the run, Nazi collaborator Paul Touvier was cornered.
When I saw this guy standing in the middle of the room, instantaneously, I recognized him as Paul Touvier.
Paul Touvier had a distinctive look. He had piercing blue eyes. I remembered war films with blue-eyed Nazis, and that shook me up.
A few seconds later, a wife came, followed by her son and her daughter, crying. And Touvier, brusquely, nastily, ordered them, "Shut up, go back to your rooms." What they did without a word. And I recognized the guy in charge of the intelligence service of the milice when he spoke to the resistant, to the Jew. I think it was the same guy, the bad guy, very bad guy.
As for his children, it was sad. They were 35 or 36 years old, and they'd never had a life. They had always lived in a monastery or abbey.
Colonel Recordon called me to tell me that Paul Touvier had been arrested. This was a big moment for me, because all of the efforts we'd put in together had concluded in a positive result. It was a clap of thunder. Fantastic.
Fantastique. For me, I won. I just won my investigation. I don't know how in English I say soulagé. I was released. After the Touvier arrest, I have a thought concerning the poor people in the concentration camps. And I thought, now is the justice time.
We had, after 40 years, finally arrested Paul Touvier. There was a flood of journalists.
Touvier faced 6 charges of crimes against humanity.
He read a statement to me. I dispute having committed crimes against humanity. I was only doing my job. He had no regrets.
The investigation shone a revealing light into a dark and secretive corner of the French Catholic Church. Paul Touvier's arrest also showed that anti-Semitism was still alive in modern France. Within days, "Death to Jews" was scrawled on the wall of a synagogue in Rouen. 5 years after Touvier's capture, his trial opened in Versailles, once the residence of the French royal family. Tensions ran high in a nation still scarred by the war.
One of the big moments in the trial is that during the 80s, he kept these notebooks called the Green Notebooks. And while he, at his trial, denied that he had maintained the same animosities he'd had before the war, when the Green Notebooks are read at his trial, it's clear that ideologically, this is a man absolutely frozen in the past. It became clear that he was very much the same man who had joined the milice and was willing to carry out crimes. Touvier was a very hateful man.
The secret notebooks were instrumental in sealing Touvier's fate. He was found guilty of crimes against humanity and sentenced to life in prison. It was an historic verdict.
Touvier was the first French citizen to be tried for and found guilty of crimes against humanity in a French court. And that's really quite extraordinary. There are not many countries that have prosecuted their own citizens for crimes against humanity.
I was looking for my mother all my life. Paul Touvier was the man who arrested my mother and sent my mother to Auschwitz. Paul Touvier has to assume the responsibility of my life, of my health.
The hunt of Touvier, for me, was a classical inquiry. Challenging, demanding, and also the right will, the determination. It was possible to succeed.